Today, let's get back into the Mac SE. Warm up the CRT, it's time for another episode. Did you know that 75% of you watching right now are not subscribed to my channel? That's bonkers. Engagement is what makes or breaks a YouTube channel, and I need your help. Subscribe today, and let's build a community together. So reviewing where we left off from last time, we did a lot of cleaning to the board, cleaned a lot of the pins on the ROM chip here, fixed the real-time clock, replaced the capacitors, all of that magic to get the board back up to a working state. And at the end, we found out that the floating point unit seems to have an issue. We diagnosed that, of course, by putting an oscilloscope on the chip select pin of the floating point unit, and every time that this guy got asserted is when the Mac would hang. So I just, on a whim, decided to disconnect that pin and pull it high, the chip select pin, so that the Mac would never think that there was a floating point unit there. Okay, fine. And by doing so, it fixed the problem. And by fixed, I mean it stopped hanging. But we haven't actually solved anything. All we've done is kind of work around the issue. So let's dig into what could be causing this problem. Now, it could just be the floating point unit itself, of course. It could just be failed. And based on the damage in this area, especially to the video ROM, the corrosion to these chips, the corrosion that happened right here to the ROM, the junk down here, everything in this area near the where the battery used to be, it stands to reason this chip could be bad. However, it could be something else. It could be any one of these resistor packs or line drivers or line buffers that connect between the floating point unit and the rest of the system. It could be a bad trace somewhere here on the board that I don't see between the floating point unit and the CPU, the floating point unit and the RAM, or the floating point unit and the ROM. Who knows? So what I want to do is I want to go through all of the possibilities that it could be, from the easiest fix to the hardest fix in that order. The easiest fix is going one by one through all these pins and tracing them through to the RAM, the ROM, and the CPU socket to make sure everything is connected properly. Because if it is just a bad trace, we can go on the back side of the board or tack onto the side of the chip here and run a repair trace to where it needs to go and solve the problem. However, I don't think that's the issue. I really do think the FPU is bad, but I want to take care of this first because replacing the FPU on this board, not the easiest thing to do. This is a surface mount chip with a heck of a lot of pins and a large surface area. I'm going to have to do a lot of masking off of things with little pieces of metal, little metal shields, and blast this with hot air for a really long time to get all that solder to melt, to get that chip off. Then do the whole process again in reverse to get a new chip back on there just to test that. I don't want to go through that entire process just to find out that the chip isn't the actual problem and it's something else. So let's go ahead and dig into that now. The tools I'm going to be using for this are basically the Mac SE schematic here or the SE30 schematic to help me figure out what pins connect to what. I've even color-coded it and printed off just to help me out a little bit. It tells me what goes in what direction between the CPU and the FPU. And then I created a flipped-over upside-down schematic of the CPU here, so I can take it out of the socket and test this from the top side, so I don't have to constantly do board flipping back and forth. And basically did the same thing for the floating point unit. So without further ado, let's get the CPU out of here so we can get access to the pins and start testing between these two devices. So first things first, we need to get the CPU out of the socket. Straightforward, you just lift up on the edges and pull it out, but this is a high tension socket. It's not a zero insertion force socket. So it takes quite a bit of effort to get this out carefully and not jam up super hard on it and bend pins. I'm going to try my chip lifter and just slowly work around the edges of it to see if I can get the chip out that way. And if that works, great. If not, I've got, a variety of other tools at my disposal. So let's see what happens. Just very, very carefully working the edge of it up. A little bit at a time. I'm using the other chips here as leverage. Now that side seems like it's popping out over here. Let's try it again from this side. Now I'm also going to hold my finger on the top of it to prevent it from flying out super fast. It's starting to move a little bit. There we go. Let's try it from this side. Yeah, it seems to be working better. I want to be very careful not to get the tool too far in there either, because I might slip in and bend the pins when it finally releases. So I want just the edge of it. But you have to be careful that you're not too little bit of the edge of it, or else you might slip off of it and crack the chip, which is bad. Can we replace this chip? Certainly. And if the chip ends up being bad, we might have to do that. But we want to avoid having to replace a chip if we don't need to. Not quite getting enough leverage on that corner. There we go, it popped out. A little twisting action on the edge. Flip it over. All the pins look good. We got the CPU out. Next is a lot of trace testing. All the pin testing is done, and all the traces that are connected between the floating point unit here and the CPU tested as connected. So I don't think we got bad traces. But looking at the junk down through here, yeah, it wouldn't surprise me if the thing has happened where the alkaline from the battery crept up the pins into the package and damaged something inside the package here. Of course, the traces, wires, and stuff inside the package are much smaller than these, so a tiny amount of corrosion that gets up in this package can cause pretty bad problems. But before we just assume that this chip is bad, I'm going to replace the CPU. I have a spare. I'm going to put the spare in it, and just to, again, eliminate the CPU as a potential problem before we go, doing the hot air reflow trick to remove this chip. Okay, before we put the new CPU in, I want to go ahead and remove my bodge wire here and reconnect the chip select pin to the board so that we can have an accurate test. Pretty easy here. Just hit that with the solder iron, pops right off. I melt this down here and that pops off. And then we got to get in here and do some footery bodge work with this pin to get that reconnected. Hope you can see what I'm doing here. I'm going to use my pokey tool, my metal pokey tool, to push this pin very carefully back down into place. Not terribly easy to do. And I'm doing it the hard way, about 1.5 feet from the board, because if I get too close to the board, my fat head is in the way and you can't see it. And you wouldn't be able to see what I was doing. So now I'm going to get something with a flat edge on it, like these tweezers here, so that I can push down on this pin carefully. And if I can't get this reconnected to the board directly, I can just run a fly wire from here down here to the glue chip where the signal is actually generated. So no big deal. Little easier said than done here. Again, perils of doing it live. Just trying to lift up on that pin just a little bit to get the curl on the underside of it to curl up so I can get it pushed back into place. I'm going to call that good enough, and I'm just going to throw some solder on it. It's not perfect, but it's in there. I don't want to risk killing it if it's a good floating point unit. I mean, we can replace it if we have to, but like, why, right? Are you focused on that? You are. Okay. Carefully. Carefully. Okay. Now, we use our test machine here. We figure out which pin on the glue chip we need to test. For that, stand by. It's pin 30. So, we just need to test this now to make sure we have connection. I want to test way up top on the pin itself to make sure we have connection through the pin. The other side on the glue chip is over in this area somewhere. There it is. So the FPU is re-enabled, and I'm going to test the pins beside it to make sure they're not cross-connected, and they are not. No. So now let's put a new CPU in there, boot it up, and see what happens. All right, I'm ready to put the new chip in. I've got my wrist strap here to protect the chip when I'm really digging into it and I get it out of the foam here. And then, of course, when we're done, we'll put the ROM and the RAM in it, plug it in, and get it up and running. So let's get it out of the foam here. Easier said than done. Okay. And this is pin 1, and this indicates pin 1 on the chip, that corner there. So we need to make sure that that is in the right direction. Make sure it fits, it feels like it fits. It does. Now here's the fun part. You have to put down an insane amount of force to get this in. There we go. All the way in. You really got to lean down on the bench and get that in there. So now let's get the ROM installed. Make sure the clips are in well. They are. Get the RAM installed. And as I install the RAM, I'm going to remind all of you out there that if you have an SE30 or an SE or any of these old Macs that have the 30-pin SIMs, many of these sockets have plastic retention clips on them, and over age they get brittle. So be very, very careful when you are removing your chips. It's very easy to pull them out to the one side while trying to get them to clear the chip and snap the clip off. This one here on this board was broken when I got it. So yeah, be careful with that. As long as you have one clip in place, the RAM will tend to stay in place just fine. But if you lose both clips, you have to resort to glue and other nasty things that you don't want to be doing. So get the RAM in there. Now, this is an old trick for putting 30-pin, or really any of these angleable memory SIMs in, is I tend to put it in, and without actually snapping into place, I tend to wiggle it a little bit to make sure it gets fully seated into the socket. That usually helps. This is just 4 megabytes of RAM, super simple. Okay, need to connect it to the Mac itself. We need a mouse and keyboard. All right, let's change angles here and show you the screen, turn it on. We'll find out if this fixed the problem. All right, here we are ready to go. Now this should be a pretty quick test because we know that this ROM here, the Rominator 2, crashes immediately when the FPU is connected. So we should pretty quickly just see garbage on the screen if this does not solve the problem, if it's not a bad CPU. So let's just go ahead and turn it on. Of course, it always chimes, but do we get garbage? We have garbage on the screen, pretty definitive. So the CPU isn't the problem, traces are not the problem. I am pretty sure that is a bad floating point unit. So next stop, get out the hot air gun and remove it from the board. So here's the kind of janky setup I've got here, done to the best of my kind of admittedly not perfect skills. Used some cut up pieces of some soda can, pop can, whatever you want to call it, to basically as heat sinks, as heat shields to prevent the plastics in that area from getting messed up. And just as a precautionary measure as well, I went ahead and removed the ROM and RAM chips because you never know. So basically the idea here is I'm going to add a lot of flux to this area, and I'm going to hit it with my hot air gun, and hopefully I can get this hot enough, and with the flux it'll help all of that that solder melt, and the chip will just pop right off the board. And that'll give me the chance also to look underneath here, clean up any nasty that might be lurking underneath this chip, clean up the pads and traces traces, and then do another test against the CPU pins just to make sure everything is good before I put that that floating point unit back in there. So I'm going to go ahead and set up to do that. Probably going to do a time lapse for you because this might take a while and it might be boring to sit and watch me heat this for 20 minutes. So let's get going. Smoky. Okay, so the chip is removed. That took way longer than I thought it would, and I had to do a cheatsy doodle. I actually did a combination of the hot air trick and putting a wire all the way, or a solid piece of wire. This stuff, solid piece of that stuff right there, all the way around the outside of the chip, and just added gobs and gobs of solder so that I'd have a nice, for lack of a better way to put it, a nice large heat sink on the board there so that it would retain enough heat to come off, because I don't, as I've said in other videos, I'm cheap and I don't have the right tool to do this, but I improvised and managed to take care of it. So the next step here is to add a little bit of flux and clean solder to all of these pads, then use my solder braid to remove all of the solder off of those pads to make sure they're nice and super clean, and also so we can get down on there and just inspect everything, make sure everything is okay. So we're going to go ahead and do that now. So add some extra flux. This is Amtech NC559V2-TV. That is the flux that I am using. Seems to do really well. It's sticky, like it's actually sticky. It like holds stuff in place really well. So if you're putting down surface mount parts, it helps keep them in place while you're doing stuff. So that's pretty cool. So now we're just going to take a little bit of tin on the iron, not too much here, and we're just going to hit all these pads with clean iron and flux, or clean solder and flux, just to make sure they're all clean. We're not going to dwell too long on the pads, because we don't want to cause the epoxy holding the pad to the board to have problems. Just go through and clean them all up and make sure they are all good. Through this side here. Okay, they look good to me. I'm going to clean off my air and get the excess goop off of it. Now we're just going to go around with the solder braid here, the solder wick, and suck up any excess solder on those pads, because they really don't need to have a ton of solder on them to do the job. Also, cleaning up the extra solder helps us get in real close here and check to see what the conditions of the traces are underneath. Doobie doobie doo. My trademark song that I sing as I'm doing stuff. Do 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 do. Do 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 do. Okay. Just holding the solder on it and very slowly dragging it across. You don't want to put a lot of pressure down on it, and you don't want to drag it super fast either, because that can cause you also to pull or lift a pad, and that's not what we want to have happen. Okay, those pads are all cleaned up. Now we put down some isopropyl alcohol, clean it up, and when I do that, we'll come back in and I'll show you the final job. Okay, so I got everything cleaned up, and it actually looks pretty good. Down here, there's some yucky down in here, but I did go ahead and I retested all of the pins, and everything actually seems okay. They look clean, they're all connected, they all trace through correctly, so there doesn't seem to be any major issues there. So the next step would be to throw another FPU on that and solder it in and just see if it works. Well, let's look at my work. It's not the best job in the world, but it's not bad, considering I don't do stuff like this very often. It's fairly clean. Not bad for just, drag soldering. If I had done it with SMD paste and a hot air gun, it would have done a lot better, but I don't have SMD paste or a hot air gun. I will get those someday, eventually. Can I get this edge? Yeah, there we go. Yeah. Looks okay, I suppose. Well, let's get it plugged in and turned on. Okay, well, we get to see how well I did surface mount soldering of the FPU, so here goes. Ah, we got dings. That's good. No garbage on the screen. That's even better. I have to wait for it to do its power on self-test here. Check all the RAM. I'm going to boot to the ROM image that comes with a big mess of wires chip here. Man, it looks like it's working. I really can't complain about that. So I'm going to run an FPU test, and we are going to see if it actually is working. So let's go ahead and run speedometer here. Speedometer. I'm going to run an FPU benchmark, and I'm just going to run each of those once, and we're going to see what happens. It's working. That's awesome. Ta-da! Oh, that is great. So now I'm going to run this test again, but I'm going to run a bunch of iterations to really give the FPU a stress test. Alright, well, what's left with this machine? I don't know. Giving it absolutely the maximum amount of memory it could take? $128 MB. Yeah, baby. Now you can see the system software is sucking up all that space. And why? Well, because the operating system that's on here doesn't have the control panel installed in order to allow me to do, or to set it to 32-bit addressing. So I guess what next would be to, I don't know, install an internal hard drive with the right OS so we can use all that memory? And by hard drive, I mean a SCSI 2 SD. I went ahead and removed my mini scribe drive out of my Mac SE chassis and put in the SCSI 2 SD. It kind of flops around in here, but that's no big deal. Before I installed this, I took the board out of the SCSI SD holder and actually soldered in a little header bracket so that the front LED will blink when the LED on this blinks. So that is super cool. Now, there are quite a bit of other sets of instructions out there on how to actually set up a SCSI 2 SD to work properly with the Mac. I suggest Brankus Creations review of that, and I will put a linky card up there somewhere about that. His description of how to do this is super awesome. So now we just got to get this put into the machine and actually install the operating system. And I'm going to skip over the operating system installation because, that's 2 hours of boring watching progress bars. And because it's fun, let's watch the whole boot sequence. Ha ha ha, blinky light. I like that. I also removed some of the extensions I didn't need. And there we are. About this Macintosh, 755, the suggested operating system for the SE30. And look, we're using our RAM correctly. Now keep in mind, if you're trying to install system software 755 on an SE30 or 761 or any of that, and you're using the big mess of wires Raminator 2, there are a very specific set of instructions you have to follow on Steve Chamberlain's website to get the operating system to run correctly. It involves editing the Gestalt ID of the machine in the system binary and things like that, because the installer, because this ROM isn't any actual ROM that matches a real Mac, it's kind of a hodgepodge of different ROMs put together. You have to hack it so that the operating system installer will work correctly and run properly after installation. Well, I'm so glad we were able to get this Mac SE30 up and working again. It just goes to show with a little love, a little effort, and a little time, you can make any old computer work. And that's the whole point, isn't it? I'd like to thank Ron from Ron's Computer Videos for sending me the board to work on, Steve Chamberlain of Big Mess of Wires for making the awesome Raminator 2 ROM chip to allow me to do some awesome upgrades to this machine, and I also want to thank Brankus Creations for his excellent walkthrough of how to set up the SCSI to SD to work on an old Mac. Thanks for hanging out with me today. Remember to like, subscribe, and ring the bell to stay up to date on my latest adventures. You can also support me through Patreon or by snagging some merch at jcm-1.com. Links in the description. Well, that's all for today's episode. While you're here, check out some of my other videos, and remember, one old Mac is all you need.